John chapter 2 is a real turning point in the life of Christ. Obviously, we know this as the time in the life of Christ that is identified as his first miracle. If you don't know any other miracle that Christ performed, you know this one. You know the first one. And it's interesting how this ties into the lesson that Jordan preached last Sunday at the 1050 assembly. In fact, if you just take John 2, 1 through 11 as standalone, we really miss the significance of what is taking place here. So we have to back up to John chapter 1 and verse 19. Because he says, now this is the testimony of John. Now keep in mind, this is the testimony after what Jordan shared with us of what meant the Word became flesh. Here was the Word. The Word became flesh. It brought grace and truth. And so it says, now this is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? This is day one. And then we come to verse 29. The next day, which constitutes day two, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Verse 35 says, and the next day, which constitutes the third day, Jesus stood with two of his disciples. And looking at Jesus, as he walked, he said, behold the Lamb of God. You come to verse 43. It says, the following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, which constitutes the fourth day. So here in the first 43, verse 55, 51 verses of John chapter 1, we have constituted the first 4 days that John talks about relative to the life of Christ as he begins his public ministry. And then we come to chapter 2 and verse 1. And it says, on the third day. Now, my extent of math does not go to trigonometry, calculus, and anything much more complicated than 1 plus 1. But I can add 4 plus 3. And so what we have now, beginning in verse 2, or chapter 2 and verse 1, is the seventh day. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. So here John introduces us to the first 7 days of Christ when grace and truth appeared. That's significant to put it in that context. Let me push your pause button just a moment and say what this is not talking about. With capital I, capital S, capital N, capital O, and capital T, exclamation mark, is not talking about. Jesus did not perform this miracle with the contemplation that in 2019, people would be taking this text and using it to justify or to excuse or to talk about social drinking or the use of intoxicating beverages. And if all we do is look at John 2 and use it as an argument for or against the use of intoxicating beverages, then we have missed it top, side, backwards, bottom, upside, and down. The second thing that Jesus is not contemplating in this is a commentary on marriage. He's not looking at this and saying, well, let me go to this and make a commentary about marriage here. No, that's not what he's talking about. There's going to be plenty he's going to say about marriage. There's going to be plenty the Holy Spirit's going to say about marriage. But that's not what this miracle is about. This is just the circumstance under which Jesus performs this first miracle. I think there's a third thing that is not, but is an aside that I think is interesting to observe about this. How do we often view Jesus? I wonder sometimes if when we think about Jesus, we think about this stoic individual who never smiled. Oh, we have passages where he got angry, where he came to the temple and he thrashed everybody and everything in the temple. And we have passages that say that Jesus would weep. But there's something significant about this that also leads us into a point of his humanity as well. What was the knock against John the Baptizer? What was the knock against John? Well, he kind of dressed funny, and he ate weird food, and he was kind of an ascetic. He kind of separated himself from the people. He really didn't pay much. He wasn't a guy who really enjoyed a good time. All you get about John is he's preaching to these people and called them a brood of vipers. Man, he is salty. And Jesus tells the Jews, you know, you weren't happy about John when what he did, he came in and he scathed you and peeled hide and hair off of you. But now I come eating and drinking with you, you're still not happy. You're like a bunch of kids. I pop in funeral music, you don't like that. I pop in rock music, you don't like that. I pop in cultural music, you don't like that. There's nothing that happens to you that you enjoy. But this is a wedding feast. Wedding feasts are not somber occasions, well, except for maybe the bride's father. Because he's having to give this girl away to this hairy-legged boy he didn't raise, and then also he's broke after it's all over. But that's an aside. And then when he's asked who gives this bride away, as he bites his tongue and pinches it out, he says, her mother, oh, I hate to lose this. Daddies like to hang on to the girls. But Jesus is here at this wedding feast, and this is an occasion of joy. This is an occasion of feasting. And what we see into Jesus here is a time in which he engaged in something that brought joy and was filled with laughter and was filled with an occasion of rejoicing. And we see that in his life. And that's part of his humanity that we need to recognize. Now, all that is just kind of an aside of things. So when we begin to look at this, let's begin reading in verse 1 again. It says, on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and the disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Jesus said to her, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. And when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servant who had drawn the water pots knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Let's break this down and look at a few things. First of all, when we think about this, we think about the purpose of signs. The first thing we see about this is that, number one, John identifies this as the first miracle. Now, John's been with Jesus for 3 or 4 years, or 3.5 years, and he's never seen anything like this before. And this is something that really astounds John. This is something that causes a sense of amazement, astonishment with him. And so John records this. That's the first thing that we observe about this. The second thing I think that is observed about this is that the miracles of Jesus are never questioned. In fact, just flip over real quick to John chapter 3 and verse 2. Just one passage of several in John. He said, this man came to Jesus, Nicodemus, by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. Notice, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And in fact, not even the rulers who want to put him to death denied the signs, denied the miracles. And so the miracles were never denied. The other thing, if you turn to the very last passage in the Gospel of John, and this really sets the Gospel of John in its total context. When you look at John chapter 20 and you turn to verse 30 and 31, listen to how John will close his Gospel. He said, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." In fact, when you turn back to this miracle in John chapter 2, you find that's exactly what takes place with the disciples. As we read, it says, "And his disciples believed in him." John says, "I'm writing this gospel so that when you see these signs, it will produce belief." Now, we're going to come back to that in the end. That's important to nail down. But here's the reason John writes. A fourth thing that I think is important to lay out here in the beginning is that Jesus performed miracles to meet needs. You would think, with regard to the way miracles are talked about in the world today, this is a miracle, that's a miracle, that you find on every page of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation a miracle being performed. But the fact of the matter is, when you catalog the entirety of that time, miracles were infrequently performed. They were performed on rare occasions. In fact, statistically it's not a handful, but I'm saying figuratively, compared to the volume of information that we have, it's only a handful of times that you find miracles recorded in the Bible. Why? Because Jesus wasn't here performing miracles just to be a man who would perform something sensational. He wasn't out to try to woo the crowd with sleight of hand. He wasn't out to try to woo the crowd to gain the attention of people by performing these signs that would point to something significant. Jesus performed these miracles to meet needs. But not everyone who came to him with a need received a miracle. That's also important to recognize. John will talk about that in chapter 5. And so when Jesus performed these miracles, they were to meet needs. Now, what's taking place here? What's taking place here is this wedding feast. And in that culture, unlike what our culture today is if there was something to be provided, it wasn't provided, then the hosts were subject to legal repercussions. The bridegroom could be sued because they ran out of what the supplies were. Now, most of the time when we have our weddings, the mother of the bride and the bride are concerned about, is there going to be enough cake? Is there going to be enough of this, enough of that? Are we going to run out of food? That's simply because you don't want somebody standing in line empty-handed. That's not this. The other thing that takes place here is this event took place, this was a week-long event. It kind of reminded me of when Conrad and Mary got married. It seemed like it was going to last all night long, that they were never going to leave. It wasn't a 7-day event, but it seemed like it was going to run into that. That's the closest thing I've ever gotten to this. All of us are standing there and wondering, will they ever leave? We're tired. We want to go home. Leave. Go, go, go. This was a week-long event in which what would happen was the bridegroom would be paraded through the city and go to the house of the bride and bring her back. And then the wedding would take place after that. Also, this was not in the culture like you and I do, where Ryan simply chose Alyssa and Alyssa chose Ryan. This was more times, often than not, something arranged. And so it not only was something that had to do with a legal repercussion if things were not provided, it was a very culturally significant thing that if this didn't come off this way, then it was an insult to the parents who had arranged this. And so it's very significant what takes place here. Jesus did this to meet a need. The second thing I want to think about with you here is, what do these signs point to? And it's interesting, when you look at John's gospel as he talks about this in chapter 20, many other signs Jesus did. Now, circle that word signs, because that's significant of how John talks about what he's going to refer to here. John doesn't so much refer to the miracles as miracles as he refers to them as signs. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke will talk about miracles. John, more time than not, talks about signs. Well, the sign signified something. The sign pointed to something. The sign pointed to something that was not what the event was. It was pointing to something else the event was intended to point the observers to. In other words, the miracle was not the thing. In our society today, especially in the religious world, the miracles are the thing. And if you can't perform a miracle, then you just are nobody, because the miracles are the thing. The miracles were never the thing. Yes, they were to confirm, but they were to point to something more than just the miracle. There was a message, there was a person that was to be identified with that the miracles were pointing to. And so that's significant to observe that what he's talking about here. Now, what do the miracles point to? What are the miracles? What message are the miracles pointing to? Well, the first thing we see about this is that here the miracles are pointing to Jesus as the Creator. In fact, when you turn back to John chapter 1, as Jordan talked about last week, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made. And then here is that one that is the Word that becomes flesh and dwelt among them. Here is the one who is the Word that was in the beginning and who spoke, and all things came into existence. And now here is his first illustration with John in the form of a miracle, that here is the Creator bypassing the process of creation that had been put in place and making water into wine. He'd already put the process in place to plant the seed, to produce the vine, to produce the fruit, to produce the wine, the fruit of the grape, to produce the process that produced it all. But now as Creator, He speaks. Just like He spoke in the beginning and said, "Let there be light." Now He speaks, and the water becomes wine. That refers back to something John has just talked about in chapter 1. The second thing that takes place here that I think that this points to is this talks about His compassion. I just said that miracles were performed to meet a need. And Jesus sees this couple. His mother appeals to Him and says, when they had run out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to Him, "They have no wine." And He said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." But then His mother said to the servants, "Whatever He says to you, do it." And He speaks, and the water pots are filled. Why does He do that? Because He has compassion on this young couple. Now, we're not told a lot about this wedding feast as the particulars. In fact, the couple are not even identified. The bride and the groom aren't even called by name. We are told that it takes place in Cana of Galilee. Well, Cana of Galilee would have been about approximately 7 to 9 miles northwest of Nazareth, in a town approximately of about 1,200 people. In other words, this is not going to be a thriving metropolis. If Nazareth was a hole in the wall in Galilee, then this would have been next door to the hole in the wall and the hole in the wall. This was a small, outback kind of town. Nobody would have paid much attention to it. There's something else that's suggested in this. I don't know whether to make of this, that this was a group, a couple that were poor, impoverished, or whether this was a couple whose families were wealthy. I'd rather lean to the latter, because it says, "Draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast." They were able to have a master of the feast, which to me would suggest something above just the run of the meal. And so perhaps this was a family of some wealth. Also, this might have been a family that Jesus knew. Perhaps relatives, not for sure, but a family in which Jesus and His disciples attend because they might have known this couple. And there was an acquaintance with this couple. And so they go to this wedding, and the feast takes place. And what happens then is these water pots are filled. In fact, it says there are 20 or 30 gallons, so that's 120 to 180 gallons of wine that you have in these water pots. We come then to verse 9, and it says, "When the master had tasted the water part that was made with wine, they did not know where it came from." And he says, "Look, why did you save the best for last? You don't always do that." I wonder sometimes if when we come to verse 10, he said to them, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and the guests have well drunk. Then the inferior, you have kept the good wine until now. We think that, okay, within 30 minutes, they all knocked off 180 gallons. That's not what takes place here. Jesus, out of compassion, is doing two things. Number one, he's providing a need. And number two, he's also keeping this young couple from some legal ramifications that I referred to a while ago. But number three, he's also providing something that will be sufficient for them to have well-being, enough financial ability to set themselves up after their marriage. In other words, he's providing an abundance here. And there's going to be some that's left over, and it will set them on a financial course that will be advantageous for them as well. And so this sign points to who Jesus is as our Creator, and it points to His compassion that He has on this young couple. Something else that's interesting here is that when his mother speaks to him and says, turn the water to wine, he said, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? Translated, your concern is not my concern. Now, I think that helps us because sometimes we wonder whether our concerns are God's concerns. And Jesus is concerned about this couple, but what he says, woman, that's not disrespectful to her. In fact, the other time this word is uttered is in John chapter 19. I started saying John chapter 19. When he's on the cross, and he says to John, woman, behold thy son. The only two times it's spoken that way. It's a term of respect, not a term of derision. But what he's saying is, you have a concern and I have a concern, but your concerns are not my concerns. My hour has not yet come. Now, that expression, my hour has not yet come, is significant. What does it mean by my hour has not yet come? When you thread through the Gospel of John and you have that expression used, it is something that always points to the cross. The hour is coming, the hour is coming, the hour is coming, and now then he begins to say the hour has not yet come. But now then when he comes to the cross, he says the hour has come. And what he's saying is, it's not time for me yet to go there. It's not time for me yet to be glorified. The time for which I'm going to come for this hour has not yet arrived. And so he speaks to his mother about that. And so then why does he say my hour has not yet come and then turns the water to wine? Because he identifies the hour pointing to his crucifixion that the text will further develop in John chapter 9. And then says, now then out of compassion I will perform this miracle. To this nondescript couple in this nondescript place to provide something that they need. I think there's another thing this miracle points toward, and that is it points to change. It points to change. Notice he turns the water to wine. This identifies him when you look prophetically. If you turn back to the book of Joel just a moment. In Joel chapter 3. Jesus is going to speak with regard to the place that wine has in the coming of the Messiah. In Joel chapter 1 and verse 5, and Joel chapter 1 and verse 10, you have the language that Joel will use, speaking of being without wine, which was indicative of a judgment that was to come. But now then he will come to Joel chapter 3, and he will talk about how the wine is going to come and how it's going to be provided in a plentiful way for them. So he says, back up to Joel chapter 1 and verse 5, and I'll thread through here. I'm sorry. My mind is racing a dozen different directions. Chapter 1 and verse 5, awake, you drunkards, and weep and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because the new wine for has been cut off from your mouth. Then he will come to verse 10. The field is wasted, the land mourns, for the grain is ruined, the new wine is dried up, the oil fails. You see, there it's associated with the fact that here now a judgment has come. But Joel says, when the wine will flow down from the mountains, is indicative of when the Messiah would come. What you have in John chapter 2 then is a fulfillment of what Joel will talk about when he speaks about the wine flowing from the mountaintops. The wine is going to flow. The blessings of God are going to come. And as these blessings of God come, you'll know this is the time of the Messiah. So when he turns this water into wine, he begins to think back about what Joel is talking about. When the wine will flow from the mountains, you'll know this is the time of the Messiah. This miracle is a message about pointing to the fact Jesus is now come. He is the Messiah. He is the one we have been looking for. That's the primary message here. But what does he do? He does that by changing water into wine. And not just a little bit, but in abundance. In other words, there's a change that's taking place. There's a transformation that's taking place. John's gospel is largely a gospel about transformation. And here this transformation occurs, and that's exactly what Paul will talk about in Romans chapter 8 and verse 29. Those whom he called, he justified. Those whom he justified, he glorified, that they might be conformed to the image of his Son. And so this miracle is indicative of the fact the Messiah has come. Wine is flowing from the mountains now. Abundance is here. And now then, transformation has begun. And think about that. It's not just transformation of water to wine. It's transformation of a man named Peter to a rock. It's transformation of a man called the Son of Thunder to the Apostle of Love. It's a transformation of a man that's a tax collector to Matthew, the Apostle. It's a transformation of a demon-possessed woman named Mary to a woman who would serve Jesus. It's a transformation of a man known as Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor, to the Apostle Paul. It's a transformation of me and you. And what he says is, you're no longer water. Now you're wine. You have been changed. And what happened as a result of that? As a result of that, significantly what happened was the disciples believed. Well, isn't that not unlike me and you? Someone sat down and taught us the gospel. We heard the gospel. We saw the gospel. And as a result of that believing, we were brought to Jesus to be baptized, to be changed. If all we see in this miracle is the water turned to wine, we've missed the miracle. What changed in this was not the water. What changed in this were the disciples. They're the ones that changed. And I would suggest to you that every time we come face to face with Jesus, we don't leave the same. We are changed. And that's what John is trying to get us to see. That's what the message points to. But let's conclude with this. There are two final things I want to observe with you. Number one, Jesus provided abundance. He came to give life, and that abundantly, John chapter 10, verse 10. Jesus provided abundance. Notice, he says that there was wine that was left over. There was enough for them to have left over when they had satisfied themselves. He had provided abundantly. Well, he's not going to just parse out grace. He's going to provide grace abundantly for us. It's not a little here and a little there. It's going to be lavish. He provides abundantly. The second thing I would say in closing is that he also provides excellence. He's not going to provide this in poverty. He's going to provide this in excellence. Everything that Jesus does, He does with excellence. This is not halfway. This is not sort of turning it to wine. This is not halfway that way. He does this and provides excellence. But the problem is, people don't want to change. How many times do you hear people say, well, if I saw a miracle today, I would believe? Would we? Listen, they saw miracles then and didn't believe. Lazarus was raised from the dead. They wanted to put him to death after that. They still didn't believe. It doesn't take a sign to believe. It takes the message of Jesus to believe. And the problem is, people don't want the message Jesus brings that will change them. And they don't want the excellence that He provides when we come to Him. John writes this not as it's happening. John writes this 70 years after it's happened. And he's looking back over the 70 years and says, this is what's taken place. This is what I have seen. And this is what it produced. The question is when we see Jesus, will we also believe? And will we also glorify Him? At this time, we're going to have a word of prayer. Carter, do you have a final song? We're going to have a word of prayer, and then we'll have a final song.